Let us turn to our last article. OMG, the dollar, three exclamation points. On July 29th, you published it at the Alhambra Investments blog. Any reason that, any motivation, any one item that kind of jumped into your mind and said, I got to write this?
Yeah, it's to take the DXY thesis a step further. Because if DXY, our earlier examination was about the euro, let's take a look at some of the other currencies out there that we could potentially explain or tell us something about where the dollar might be outside of the euro. So let's look at, for example, the Brazilian real or the Indian rupee or something else along those lines that can give us an indication of, would the real dollar stand up, was what I thought of the other article, not this one. But that's what, we're looking at. What is the real dollar here? Is it the XY and the euro, or are there other cases that we can look at and say, this is what's really going on in the dollar world?
Jeff, let me ask you maybe a tangential question here, but we often hear, I guess they change their minds, these officials and monetary technocrats, that they want to lower the value of the dollar, and this is supposedly good for the United States. Jeff, what do you think? Is it good, broadly speaking, for America to have a weak dollar?
Well, it does correspond to periods of better economic growth, but that I don't think is the same thing at all. And look, the textbook says, every economic textbook says, currency devaluation, debasement is a positive stimulus because of the export. It makes your exports cheaper to other people around the world to buy them. And that's the theory, is that, okay, if I weaken my own currency, that'll help me because that'll make my exports more competitive. Therefore, people will buy more of them, and that will get our economy going again, my local economy. But it's doing it at the expense of our neighbors, which is why you always hear the term currency war used alongside it. It's a beggar thy neighbor policy. I'm not getting better. The whole world is not getting better. The whole global economy is not getting better. I'm using you for myself to get better. What the economics textbook also says when the dollar is the reserve currency is that the U.S. economy, or at least U.S. officials in the mainstream economic theory, okay, yes, it's beggar thy neighbor, but it's eventually good for us and the neighbor. Because if the U.S. economy gets going by repricing its exports to become more competitive, and that gets the U.S. economy back on a solid footing, that will eventually allow the rest of the global economy to join it. So the theory from the U.S. perspective is, yes, we are conducting a currency war, but don't worry about it. Eventually, everyone will benefit from it. We'll get the benefits first, but everyone will benefit from it.
Jeff, who is Guido Montego, and is he pursuing a man with 6 fingers who killed his father?
No, I don't think it was Inigo Montoya, but as much as Guido Montego was the Brazilian finance minister who on September 27th, 2010, made headlines all across the world because he accused Ben Bernanke of igniting a currency war. This was it. After the Great Recession, we had the downturn, then we had the recovery from it was not going along as planned. They had all sorts of financial irregularities during the middle of 2010, where Ben Bernanke had come out in August of 2010 at Jackson Hole and basically said, yeah, we're going to do QE again, which then, of course, Guido and some of the other nations around the world began to say, wait a minute here. This sounds way too much like the 1930s. This sounds like way too much like intentional debasement. This is currency wars. So he was the first one to mention in any official capacity the idea that the Fed, through quantitative easing, through the idea of, quote unquote, money printing, they were going to devalue the dollar at everyone else's expense.
And where is the Brazilian real trading at today? Because the Federal Reserve has been printing like crazy, therefore devaluing the dollar like crazy. So the real should be much stronger than where it was in 2010. Am I right?
Well, yeah, it's interesting that there was all this currency war talk. It was taken as, this was guaranteed. It wasn't just something that, Brazilian finance minister was talking about. You had this group, I think what was called the E21, this group of famous economists in the U.S. who wrote that letter saying, Ben, knock it off. You're going to destroy the dollar if you do this. And that was in, I believe, November 2010 too, shortly after QE2 was launched. But the interesting thing is when you go ahead a couple of years to September 2012 with QE3, there was no talk about currency wars. In between, where the dollar was supposed to be driven into the dirt, instead it had started to go higher again. And so there's a disconnect between economic theory, which says money printing, lower dollar, export stimulus, good for everyone eventually, to Eurodollar number two, another global dollar shortage, dollar going higher again in between. So something's missing here from the mainstream, not just the mainstream discussion, but also official discussions. When you go back and look at some of the FOMC transcripts, as I have, what you find is back in November 2010, when the FOMC was actually voting to launch QE2, they were sensitive to the fact that they had been accused of igniting a currency war, because it had been in the papers, it had been in the financial media. I believe Ben Bernanke was even asked questions about it directly. So they were sensitive to it, but they also intended to do it. So they were not just sensitive to being accused of being currency warriors. They fully expected to be currency warriors. In fact, I believe some of the discussion was about how most of the benefit from these large-scale asset purchases like QE would flow from a weaker dollar. They were expecting to lower the dollar, and then the benefit of that lower dollar would be the net result, the net positive result from quantitative easing. They were expecting to use a lower dollar to be able to move the dollar lower and to use that to justify quantitative easing, even though they were being accused of being currency warriors. And the real sad thing is they don't know what makes the dollar move.
Looking at Google Trends for currency wars, and if you look up that topic, the peak was in October and November 2010. Then there was again a level of interest that rose to about half that level in February of 2013, and then a quarter of the peak in August of 2015, which is, of course, an infamous month. And then August 2019 came back to 20% of the interest of the 2010 peak. So it's only been decreasing since then, but it kept spiking during these critical moments. I have a quick question for you. Yeah, go ahead if you have anything.
That, the dollar is, that's because the dollar keeps going higher rather than lower. We keep hearing, and again, I want to read a quote that one Fed governor said during that November 2010 meeting that I think encapsulates this very discussion, this dissonance between what we're supposed to believe in terms of what the textbooks say and what actually happens in the real world. This was from Kevin Warsh, who was one of the Fed governors. He said, November 2010, voting in affirmative for QE, I think it is risky pool playing in the foreign exchange markets, asking them to do so much of our work when the world's recovery is resting on this. So what he's saying is, we're going to weaken the dollar. We know we're going to weaken the dollar, but we have to do it because the entire global recovery depends upon us being able to weaken the dollar. And what we've shown over the last decade is these people have no idea what they're doing. Number one, they don't know how the dollar actually works. Their quantitative easing doesn't push it lower because obviously the dollar has been nothing but higher, higher, higher ever since. And every time we hear about these currency wars, as you just pointed out, Google Trends is a good way to, when the public's thinking about currency wars because they're hearing about it in the financial media, every time we hear currency wars, it never lasts because then the dollar goes higher again. And they don't seem to understand, which they should understand, why does the dollar go higher? Why doesn't it go higher? There really is no official recognition of how things actually work. And that's kind of a big problem. That's the reason the whole reason for Eurodollar University. And the reason you and I are sitting here talking about it is because these people don't get how this system works. And what I hear a lot of times is, well, no, that can't possibly be because these are very smart people. We've been told from the very beginning they're very powerful, they're very wise, they can do whatever they want. And so if the dollar keeps going up, then it must be because they want it to go up or they're trying to do something. There's a plan in place here that these people can't possibly be this level of incompetent. And trust me, take it from me. Again, I have all sorts of quotes from transcripts. I've read all of these transcripts. I know how these people think. They really just have no idea how the system actually works. And they're attempting to navigate this system using outdated material. And that's really all this is. They're using textbooks that were written in the 1930s to navigate a system that hasn't been the same since the 1950s. And that really, when you look at it that way, then you start to understand why things are. It doesn't explain why they don't change. I mean, there's ideological rigidity and an institutional inertia and political questions behind everything. But it's at its essence, that's what we're talking about. They're using outdated ideology that doesn't work in the real world, as we keep seeing. Currency war was supposed to be the result in 2010. It was the intended result in 2010. Instead, the dollar is higher because they don't understand the factors behind the euro-dollar system, the euro-dollar shortage, euro-dollar squeeze.
Jeff, we started the article talking about Brazil. Brazil is one of the emerging markets Rushmore. India, Russia, China are the other three. Can you tell us a little bit about their currencies and where they're trading at? Is it similar to the Brazilian story?
Yeah, and it's similar to the broader dollar trade weighted index, which shows that since March, yes, the real, the rupee, all of these emerging market currencies were absolutely pummeled as the euro and everybody else was. But ever since the worst of the first part of the crisis back in March, they've come back a little bit, which means the Brazilian real has rebounded a little bit higher, the dollar weaker against it, but not really all that much, and certainly not in a way that we would say that would be consistent with Jay Powell's claim on 60 Minutes that he's flooded the world with liquidity, flooded the world with dollar liquidity. Quite the opposite, because the Brazilians have been actually selling their U.S. treasuries, their reserves. They've been mobilizing their local swap markets. They've been instituting these cupom cambial swaps to try to influence the currency, which indicates that no, the dollar system is not flooded with liquidity. It's not even actually normal. And the central bank is doing its level best just to tread water in the real close to its record low point. Again, it's completely contradictory to the idea that the dollar is crashing because things are going in the opposite, inflationary, plentiful money direction. We're still seeing the vestiges of this continued dollar shortage. It's not as bad as it was in March, obviously, but it's still not good. It's still pretty bad.
Jeff, the whole episode today is really focusing on the dollar, and the focus that you hear in the financial press is on the DXY, and we've explained that's really heavily weighted towards Japan and Europe. We've explained Japan is a global redistribution point. It's a world money center. And so it acts much like the dollar does when there are these disorders in the economy and finance, and people run to it for liquidity, for safety. I have a question, though. Why then doesn't the euro act that way? It's the second most popular currency in the world. Why isn't the euro behaving like the yen and the dollar during these squeezes?
Because in some ways the euro acts as the dollar. It's not essentially a completely separate system, because the banks that used to that operate in the euro dollar system as a whole are still heavily weighted toward Europe. So what drives the euro versus the dollar isn't necessarily these global dollar liquidity stuff. It's the dollar and the euro block together, and then there's differences within that block. So that's what you see to move the euro at these particular times is there's a perception about Europe becoming better than the US, and that moves the euro against the dollar, but it's irrelevant to the wider euro dollar system because it's just banks trading from one pocket to the other. That's the best explanation I can come up with, is that it's simply the same system, but the different pockets within the system.
I'm admittedly confused, but let's come back to it again in the future. Jeff, appreciate it, loved it. For our audience, please subscribe to the YouTube channels, subscribe to the podcasts, and we hope to educate you more, teach you more about this shadowy euro dollar system and how it's affecting your finances, your economy, politics, and society. Talk to you again next week, Jeff.
Take care, Emil.